Very good evening to everybody, and welcome to Hampstead Synagogue. I am the chair of Hampstead Synagogue, Richard Abramson, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to this Isaiah Berlin lecture. My role is very brief. It's principally to tell you that no alarm is planned, so should one sound, we ask you please to straight away make your exit through either the exits at the rear, where you entered the building, or the two exits either side of me, or the two, for those who are on the balcony level, the two exits again behind me, or the exit in the front. And that done, simply follow the advice of the stewards. Thank you. At this point, I am very happy to hand over to our Rabbi, Dr. Michael Harris.
Friends, good evening and a very warm welcome to the Hampstead Synagogue. It is a very great privilege to welcome all of you. We have so many very distinguished guests here. And if you'll forgive me just for extending a very special welcome to our former Prime Minister, Mr. Rishi Sunak, MP, and his wife is here with him. It's so lovely to meet you. Thank you so much for being with us. President of the United Synagogue, Mr. Michael Goldstein, with distinguished colleagues, and many others. I said in the reception, I kept seeing faces that I've only previously seen on Newsnight. So my task is just to give you a word of background about the Isaiah Berlin annual lecture. Sir Isaiah was a member of this synagogue, the family's membership having begun when his parents joined us in the 1920s. After Sir Isaiah's death, we wanted to mark his connection with our synagogue on an ongoing basis, and so we approached Lady Berlin and the members of Sir Isaiah's family to ask if they would agree to our synagogue holding an annual lecture in Sir Isaiah's memory. And we've been holding the lecture ever since. This evening is the 22nd annual lecture, and our deep gratitude goes as always to Sir Isaiah's stepson, Mr. Peter Halban, and together with Martina and the family for their close cooperation over 2 decades. Thank you so much. Our synagogue was founded in 1892. It's one of the oldest in the United Synagogue, and we pride ourselves on being a venue for high-quality educational and cultural events, and none more so than the Isaiah Berlin Lecture. For more than 2 decades, Zaki Cooper has worked tirelessly and with immense skill and dedication in spearheading the organisation of the lectures and in securing a quite extraordinary world-class roster of lecturers who have reflected on Sir Isaiah's intellectual legacy from a rich multiplicity of perspectives. It's a great pleasure to warmly welcome this evening's lecturer, Reid Hoffman. I'm just going to provide a word of Jewish context, if I may, since we are in the sanctuary, which whose main purpose, of course, is prayer and study. Just a word of Jewish context. There's a commonplace that Judaism sees technological advance as morally neutral, and that it depends what we do with it, whether the technology is good or is evil. The internet, for example, can be used for wonderful charitable purposes, and it can be used, as we all know, for evil purposes. But the greatest exponent of modern orthodoxy in 20th century America, Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, has a different stance, and he sees technology as intrinsically good. In his famous essay, The Lonely Man of Faith, he argues that human beings who are able, for example, to conquer diseases which historically plagued humanity, thereby achieve greater dignity for humanity. A person who travels from New York to London in a few hours on a comfortable plane, rather than over a few weeks in a storm-tossed ship, represents greater human dignity, the dignity which God wants human beings to achieve by utilizing the prodigious capabilities with which he has endowed us. And were he with us today, Rabbi Soloveitchik, I think, might have said that the human being who can contact another human being across the globe instantaneously by email or WhatsApp or LinkedIn achieves a greater human dignity than the person who has to rely on the vagaries of the postal system, as those of us of an older generation remember. And so the kind of work for which our lecturer, Reid Hoffman, is so well known is something that has a very significant dimension from the perspective of Jewish faith. And I now hand over to Zaki to formally introduce our lecturer.
Thank you, Rabbi Harris. My lords, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to our beautiful synagogue this evening, and in particular to welcome Reid Hoffman to deliver this year's Isaiah Berlin lecture. We're now in the 22nd year of the lecture, and whilst previous lecturers have included a former Prime Minister, a Chief Rabbi, an Archbishop, and a former Lord Chief Justice, I know it sounds like the start of a joke, we have never attracted quite as distinguished an audience as we have tonight. So to all of you visiting the synagogue for the first time, we're delighted to have you with us. Thank you for coming, and for those of you who drove, thank you for your patience with the parking. We have so many notable attendees this evening from the upper echelons of business, technology, the professions, media, and public service, as well as leaders from the Jewish community. Indeed, had Reid been held up in London traffic tonight, we would have had no end of people who could deliver an erudite lecture at short notice. But thankfully, that's not the case. We're absolutely thrilled that Reid has come all the way from California to be with us this evening to talk about a subject on everybody's minds, AI. Reid is quite simply one of the giants of Silicon Valley and one of the most influential and impactful technologists in the world today. He's an entrepreneur, executive, and investor who has founded and scaled consumer technology businesses. In 2003, as everyone knows, he co-founded LinkedIn, the world's largest professional networking service, which now has an estimated 1 billion users worldwide. He also played a key role in the success of PayPal, and as an investor, he has been instrumental in the growth of iconic companies such as Facebook and Airbnb. Nowadays, he is a partner in Greylock and host of the popular podcast, Masters of Scale. He's the author of 3 best-selling books, with another one out in the new year, as well as co-founder of Inflection AI. He's a passionate philanthropist and has been recognized through an honorary CBE and a Salute to Greatness Award from the Martin Luther King Center. Reid's connection with Isaiah Berlin is that in his 20s, he studied for a master's at Wolfson College, Oxford, where Sir Isaiah had been the founding president. And what would Berlin have made of AI and the state of affairs today? That we can only speculate about. The world that he inhabited was entirely different from today's hyper-connected, multimedia instant world. Born in 1909 in Riga, there was no television in those days, while the computer and internet were several decades away. Over 100 years on, we're at the early stage of a technological revolution, encapsulated by AI, what some call the fourth industrial revolution. There's an old Jewish joke where a youngster flies to the other side of the world for an extended break. He sends a postcard back home to his parents as follows: "Start worrying, details to follow." Perhaps that is how many of us feel about AI. Can we harness the technology for good? Can it help us at work and in our personal lives? Will it make us better educated and healthier? At the same time, there are profound anxieties. As the technology becomes more sophisticated, where will this leave people? What sort of world are we bequeathing to our grandchildren? There is no one better placed to address these questions than Reid Hoffman, and I'm delighted to invite him to deliver this year's Isaiah Berlin Annual Lecture, Super Agency, Empowering Humanity in the Age of AI. Reid, over to you.
Good evening, everyone. It is an honor to be with you here today, sharing this moment with you. 33 years ago, I had the extraordinary fortune of attending the first of a related Isaiah Berlin lecture that was at the University of Oxford in the Wolfson Auditorium when I was a graduate student there in philosophy. The speaker that evening was one of my heroes, Stephen Jay Gould. Gould had a gift for making complex scientific principles not only accessible, but also deeply engaging, elegant wit, and abiding commitment to humanism. Using a bit of intellectual taxonomy that Isaiah Berlin himself helped popularize, tagging thinkers as either hedgehogs or foxes, those who know one big thing versus those who know many things, Gould would have qualified as the latter. He was a nimble thinker whose essays danced from subject to subject. And while he wrote with great precision, he did so in ways that always embraced the full complexity of the universe and human existence, which is no doubt why Gould was chosen to speak at that lecture. These were the characteristics Sir Isaiah embodied too. While Sir Isaiah had some deep, some might even say hedgehog-like, commitment to understanding liberty, he was too fox-like in his synthesis of so many different disciplines, perspectives, and historical contexts. With this multidisciplinary approach, he brought new clarity and nuance to the many paradoxes of freedom. In his first lecture as Oxford Chichele Professor of Social and Political Theory in 1958, Two Concepts of Liberty, he showed us that the richness of human experience lies in the tensions and contradictions arising out of the human values and their irreducible plurality. So tonight, I'd like to start by invoking the two concepts he explored in that lecture: negative liberty and positive liberty. The former, negative liberty, being the freedom from external constraints and interference. The latter, positive liberty, being the freedom to take actions that can help one realize their full potential. Today, I believe we should keep these concepts front and center as we try to understand the opportunities, risks, obligations, and impacts of AI. Because ultimately, I believe we're in the midst of a new steam power moment. And by that, I mean a revolutionary technology breakthrough that expands what it means to be human. A breakthrough that will change how we think about freedom, autonomy, agency, and other key aspects of the human condition. In Two Concepts of Liberty, Sir Isaiah emphasized how value pluralism, or the idea that values are relational and often in competition with each other, is a phenomena we must account for when theorizing about the nature and limits of political freedom. Prioritizing safety, for example, can diminish liberty. Prioritizing innovation can diminish stability. And yet, even through values like these that are clearly relational, in constant flux, we still often think of them as timeless, natural phenomena. Consider the symbols we use to invoke their essence. Since we're here in the UK, the Union Jack, Old Glory, the Magna Carta, the Liberty Bell, so unchanged and enduring and seemingly immutable, as if freedom and liberty themselves are timeless ideals fixed in a vacuum of absolute truth. but they're not. They're fundamentally dynamic constructs shaped by politics, historical context, but most of all, I believe, technology. Building on this premise, I'd like to spend my time with you tonight exploring 4 simple but important observations. The first is that in fully acknowledging the extent to which new technologies actually define, expand, and redefine how we experience essential human values like freedom and agency, we put ourselves in a much better position to design these technologies in ways that maximize human flourishing. The second is something of a paradox. While today's breakthrough technologies create tomorrow's freedoms, we often greet these tech breakthroughs as threats to individual liberty and autonomy, because our current idea of freedom is mostly constructed by what previous technologies have enabled. So the postcard, start worrying, just not yet. As I will explore in greater detail shortly, this is very much the case for AI. The third observation I want to share with you tonight involves how we might overcome the challenge identified in the second. Specifically, I'll suggest we need to design and deploy AI tools that emphatically prioritize individual agency in a way that synthesizes negative liberty and positive liberty. My fourth observation is that it's essential to view individual agency as part of a larger framework rather than simply an end into itself. We seek conditions conducive to individual agency because individual agency serves as a flywheel to strong societies and a pathway to collective action and broad prosperity. Most ambitiously, I'm going to weave all of these ideas together in the form of a TikTok dance video that features Sir Isaiah as an AI-generated cartoon fox. Just kidding. Out of respect for Sir Isaiah's dignity and my dignity and your dignity, I'm most definitely not going to do that. I am going to introduce a new word that aims to capture these converging ideas: superagency. Superagency, as I define it, is what happens when large numbers of people gain access to a transformative, general-purpose technology that they're free to use in self-determined ways. When that happens, individuals get new superpowers to apply to their lives in unrestricted, inventive, and personally relevant ways. While this greatly enhances their individual agency, that's far from the only way they benefit, because so many other people have new superpowers too. New capabilities and adaptations cascade through society, endowing every individual with a multitude of second-order benefits as well. In the early days of the automobile, for example, doctors could suddenly make more house calls per day. They could expand the territory they covered. This made doctors more personally productive, but also helped everyone they served. In the early days of the World Wide Web, it suddenly became possible to make your essays or your shareware programs, or your photos of your cat, accessible to a global audience. A huge boost in your individual agency and powers of personal expression. Just as consequentially, though, millions of others were doing the same, so knowledge of all kinds became far more accessible to you. So when I say superagency, that's what I mean. Drawing inspiration from John Stuart Mill's Experiments in Living, Adam Smith's Invisible Hand, and Sir Isaiah's pluralism, superagency cast individual empowerment as an intentional but decentralized path toward diverse forms of collective well-being. With AI, I believe we're headed towards our biggest superagency moment since the advent of steam power. To get there, though, we have, as a society, to make the right choices. They're big choices, and they're complex choices. And let's be honest, achieving consensus on big, complex issues has never been humanity's strong suit. Especially these days, when the culture wars are waged 24/7, many of these clashes involve competing visions of freedom. For example, the freedom to express whatever you want online versus the freedom to engage in democratic or other civil dialogue without having to pay the price of constant harassment. The freedom, this is a very American example, to open carry at Starbucks versus the freedom to send your kids to schools where chalkboards play a bigger part in their education than metal detectors do. A particularly American phenomena, as is this next one. The freedom to advocate for the deregulation of everything right after we re-regulate borders, free trade, and reproductive freedom. But I also want to make it very clear that these aren't just partisan choices. They reflect something essential about freedom. As Sir Isaiah puts it in his lecture, freedom for the pike is death for the minnows. Or, freedom for an Oxford Don is a very different thing than freedom for an Egyptian peasant. Because of how specific claims to liberty hit different constituencies in different ways, Sir Isaiah showed they can be fundamentally incompatible and even incommensurable, which is to say they can't be measured against each other on a single scale. They exist in different moral dimensions. And this is true of values in general, not just liberty. This is value pluralism in action. The pike wants absolute freedom to hunt whenever it suits it. The minnow makes a principled case about the right to swim without constant fear of hungry pikes. These two freedoms cannot fully exist together, nor is there a perfectly rational way to balance or optimize this clash of values. But the needs of the pike and the needs of the minnows are valid and vital, so the best we can do is to seek imperfect and dynamic compromises. Some risk for the minnows, some constraints on the pike. Every society where competing visions of the good life coexist requires both negative and positive liberty to thrive. The former to create zones of autonomy, free will, and experimentation, free from external interference. The latter to provide frameworks and resources like public utilities or law enforcement agencies or educational systems that can help enable people to pursue and fulfill their potential, which ultimately means that the work of civilization involves trade-offs. In many instances, these trade-offs are paradoxical. Laws don't just limit, they also liberate. In some contexts, a bridge can create more safety and security than a wall can. And sometimes freedom can be incredibly constraining. What do I mean by that exactly? As I suggested earlier, when a truly novel or transformative technology appears, we often find it threatening because most of the time we can't foresee with any real acuity the new world it's going to create. Instead, all we see, all we know is the world that exists, the one this new technology is threatening to change. So we tend to focus on what could possibly go wrong and what we might possibly lose, rather than what could possibly go right and what we might possibly gain. Take the increasing industrialization of the early 1800s. By that point, technological innovations like the flying shuttle and the spinning jenny had already transformed textile productions in England. The weavers were already the beneficiaries of technological progress. But it was a technological progress they'd become comfortable with, technological progress that they knew. What was known as the domestic system, weavers often worked from home on looms. Sometimes they owned these human-powered machines. Sometimes they rented them from merchants who also supplied them with raw materials and purchased the finished cloth they produced. Either way, weavers of this era controlled many aspects of their daily work. They set their own schedules, they managed their own production processes, and generally, they earned a decent living and led autonomous lives, especially compared to peasant farmers from prior centuries. So when large-scale factories with much higher degrees of automation started growing more common, consider how that might have played to a weaver from that era. Rigid schedules, close supervision, increasingly mechanized and repetitive workflows. That didn't sound like progress. That sounded like prison. These weavers, who would become known as Luddites, are remembered and sometimes championed today for their multi-year effort to destroy the machines they felt were threatening their agency and autonomy. In the short term, their perspective, if not their methods, was understandable. In the long term, though, in which world would you want to spend your precious one and only life? A world where you can pursue thousands of different educational paths and an even broader array of careers? Or a world in which you can be a weaver or the wife of a weaver? But the Luddites couldn't see the world that was coming. They only knew what they knew. Their world was ending. And that certainly didn't feel like freedom. Over the span of the next few decades, though, the liberating impact of industrialization grew increasingly evident. And this accelerated rapidly as steam power took hold. Suddenly, inventors and entrepreneurs could build factories and other industrial operations anywhere, not just near waterways or places where windmills were practical. This new facility to deploy synthetic energy in highly configurable and location-agnostic ways didn't just reorganize how a few industries operated, or create entirely new ones, or strengthen nation-states. I mean, yes, it did all those things, very much so. But even more profoundly, it dramatically expanded the meaning of freedom. It introduced new ideas and expectations around agency, autonomy, dignity, and equality. In doing so, it reshaped not just how people lived, but how they thought about what it meant to live as well. For the first time, vast numbers of people could imagine a life beyond the constraints of their immediate geography. With rail travel, steamships, growing transportation networks, the prospect of covering greater distances much faster was not just possible, it was increasingly accessible. This transformed aspirations and expectations. It created an appetite for choice and possibilities, freedom to move, freedom to explore, freedom to seek out new opportunities. Mobility itself became a key dimension of freedom. Global immigration exploded in scales, with some 60 million Europeans alone migrating to new lands between 1815 and 1914. This movement of people across borders helped spread ideas and innovations and opportunities as never before. Indeed, while all this was happening, steam-powered printing operations enabled much larger press runs. Rail travel dramatically increased distribution capabilities. National postal systems, which we heard about a little earlier, our first scalable communications networks, greatly increased their delivery speeds. They expanded the geographic territories they connected. The volume of mail they carried skyrocketed. In time, we began to see rising literacy rates, magazines with circulations in the millions, the penny press, mail order catalogs, and the expanding commercial culture, the telegraph and the telephone, all of which helped create more access to an ever-broadening array of information and perspectives. Probably for the first time ever, inbox overload was becoming a thing. And yet, the overwhelming net result was freedom, opportunity, countless new ways to seek purpose and fulfillment as individual liberty itself became progressively more central to what it meant to be human. Of course, the steam age was hardly the first instance of this process. For all of the many different attributes that define us as a species, I believe humanity is best described as homo techne. We're fundamentally makers and doers, forever modifying and expanding what it means to be human by making new tools and applying them to our lives. Fire, spears, clothing, agriculture are just the beginning of our techne journey. In essence, the pattern's a simple one. Technology makes a new thing possible, and that new thing changes our conceptions of what freedom means, how it's experienced, and who gets access to it. Because of technology, we have freedom from subsistence living. We have freedom from diseases that once existed as certain death sentences. We have freedoms from darkness, and hopefully boredom, who knows, you guys here, social isolation, and because of technology, we have the freedom to share and acquire knowledge across space and time, the freedom to repair and enhance our biology, the freedom to pursue and refine the ideal of who we want to be. At the same time, technology is also a major way we impose and enforce constraints on our freedom. So it's easy to see why technology, especially the new technological breakthroughs, are often perceived as threats to negative liberty. Traffic lights constrain our movement through cities. Locks and security systems limit access to physical space of all kinds. Border walls define and enhance national boundaries. Workplace surveillance software monitors employees' productivity and behaviors. Digital rights management systems restrict how we use content. Payment processing systems track and sometimes block our transactions. In all of these scenarios, however, positive liberty is also in play. Traffic lights and other traffic control systems create the order and predictability that it can enable us to proceed both faster and more safely through complex environments. Locks and security systems enable us to protect ourselves and our property. Payment processing systems make it possible for us to buy goods from around the world on credit. Still, when truly novel and powerful technologies like AI appear, defensive reflexes tend to kick in. Consider outfitting an imaginary city with even more closed-circuit television cameras than you've got here in London. Cameras everywhere, and they're all augmented with facial recognition software, microphones, license plate readers, and behavioral monitoring algorithms. Buildings augmented with sensors tracking entry, exit, occupancy, and movement. Smart poles collecting data from air quality and pedestrian traffic. Plus, there are automated security portals that you've got to pass through at nearly every block. The most optimistic version of this network is a network of devices making intelligent and liberating use of all the data they collect. A traffic camera linked to AI doesn't just record traffic violations, it can adopt traffic light patterns, so in real time you can optimize flow, so you spend less time idling at intersections. A smart building's environment sensors don't just measure temperature, they can learn their occupants' preferences and anticipate their needs and make the whole thing more green. The dystopian version is straight out of George Orwell's 1984. The goal, in George Orwell's case, is coercion, compliance, and control, or is dystopia's case. But what about versions that attempt to evoke the probable trade-offs of pluralism with a more even hand, such as a city, for example, that might be said to represent a very clear triumph of positive liberty? Even a blind senior citizen, small of stature, slight of build, walking home alone at night and wearing an expensive diamond necklace or watch would be able to access that city's resources and amenities with a strong sense of security. At the same time, this imaginary city would also minimize invasions of privacy and liberty, or at very least the freedom that comes from many kinds of constraints. This is what I presume Sir Isaiah would describe as a collision between genuinely good things. Because who doesn't want virtually zero crime? But also, who doesn't want sufficient privacy in public? As our technologies grow more powerful and capable in acting in autonomous ways themselves, the potential number of scenarios where we might have to deploy them are going to rapidly multiply. Thus, create more and more instances where values will clash. I'm going to use another example here. Take driver alcohol detection systems. These systems use touch and breath-based sensors embedded in various parts of a car's interior to passively monitor a driver's blood alcohol level. Unlike the breathalyzer, you don't need to actively blow into these sensors for them to take effect. Instead, they use infrared light to passively monitor drivers. Touch the steering wheel, and sensors embedded there will detect the blood alcohol concentration levels through the capillaries of your fingers. Simply exhale, and the sensors embedded in the dashboard will detect the levels in your breath. These sensors don't incorporate AI themselves, but your car could also be equipped with cameras and additional sensors to use AI to analyze things like posture, grip pattern, airflow directions. In this way, they can help confirm its driver rather than any of the passengers who might also be in the car whose blood alcohol content is being measured. So imagine you just had dinner with your friends and you're now ready to go home. You had a couple glasses of wine, maybe more. The waitstaff were quick with the refills. But the dinner was leisurely, you had coffee afterwards, you feel good, definitely sober, and definitely fit to drive on the streets you know well when traffic is light. You've done it before, safely, many times, except this time your car has a different point of view. It says you're over the legal limit. It refuses to start. So you can either call an Uber or stay put until it determines you're ready to go. It turns out there was legislation passed in the US that could make systems like this as mandatory on all new cars as early as 2026. For various reasons, it may not happen that quickly or ever. But we might just make the leap to fully autonomous vehicles before we see cars with this feature because of the federally mandated rule of the road. On the other hand, it's also easy to envision this functionality eventually showing up in more limited ways. For example, delivery trucks or rental cars, or just as an option you choose with your insurance, your insurer, to get a discount. In fact, I think mechanisms like these are more likely to appear first as terms of service or contractual agreement, not public laws. Another strange example like this involves a company called MSG Entertainment, which operates Madison Square Garden, the large indoor arena in New York City. For several years now, MSG Entertainment has implemented a controversial policy that uses facial recognition technology to identify and deny entry to attorneys who work at law firms in litigation against it. We all sometimes want a system similar, but as patrons enter Madison Square Garden or other iconic venue, MSG Entertainment owns Radio City Music Hall, for example, their faces are scanned and compared against a database. If they match to an attorney on the ban list, that person is refused entry, even though they have a valid ticket. But sorting mechanisms aren't new to physical spaces. VIP lines, dress codes, ticket prices, and deliberate architectural choices, such as limited entrances, are all methods that businesses of various kinds have used traditionally to control who has access to them. But these are relatively blunt instruments compared to what kinds of constraints will become possible with physical architecture that is enhanced by AI. The Madison Square Garden policy has already prompted numerous lawsuits and ongoing debates about the appropriate balance between property rights and public accommodation. This is precisely that kind of balance of liberties that is important that we design in these new technologies. So in the coming years, instances like these, where AI devices and services can shape, nudge, automate, dictate, and even preordain what the choices we as individuals might be allowed to make, will become more common. And clearly they represent a significant paradigm shift, one where what describes as perfect control becomes increasingly possible. In this scenario, whatever the policy is, that policy is enforced every time, and suddenly you, as an individual human, have neither negative liberty nor positive liberty in this universe where AI is making all the choices. Traditionally, we humans have complied with speed limits, no parking signs, or non-smoking prohibitions, or other kinds of laws and regulatory mechanisms as part of a larger social contract. This is true in democracies, and even more true in autocratic regimes. Yet the possibility of penalties in the presence of law enforcement can deter us. But for the most part, laws that prohibit drunk driving aren't dependent on your car's voluntary decision to comply with them. They're dependent on you. So whatever role professional law enforcement plays in maintaining order and stability in a given community, it's just part of a much larger social fabric. And because police officers can't be everywhere all the time, that fabric is woven from community cooperation, mutual trust, and widely held norms of behavior. For example, you might slow roll through a red light at 4 a.m. if no pedestrian or other motorists are in sight. I'm not saying I ever do so. For any police officers in the room, you might not bother to fasten your seatbelt just when you're driving a few blocks to the grocery store. You might skip feeding a parking meter because you'll be in and out in that convenience store in less than a minute. In these instances, you're making a choice, exercising your agency. In all these instances, you always have the option to ignore the law or rule in question, often at very little risk of penalty. What this means is that in many ways, the social contracts that help create safety and stability in modern societies have always been relatively easy to live up to. Enforcement is imperfect and intermittent. We have breathing room to make our own choices. Now, however, we possess technologies that make it possible to enforce the letter of law in ways that can all but eliminate the leeway we've typically guaranteed ourselves to exert perfect control. Red light cameras incorporated in traffic signals, which don't need complex algorithms or decision-making processes to perform their functions, are one clear example that is already widely deployed, but AI broadens the possibilities. It's not just that CCTV equipped with facial recognition might function as a powerful way to reduce or entirely eliminate muggings, assaults, or other kinds of crimes that I'm sure most people broadly in favor are reducing or eliminating. At some point, as technologies evolve, instances of jaywalking at rush hour could result in an automatic fine, just the way that speeding through a red light camera does now. Noise violations, off-leash pets, public intoxication, all of these things could essentially become zero-tolerance offenses. And if you're like me, a society actually operating in this fashion might strike you as absurd, intolerable, even humane. Yet the laws that prohibit these various actions already exist. Presumably, we're supposed to obey them. So I imagine there may be people who are likely to favor this as a more exacting form of law enforcement. All of which is to return to the point I started with tonight, and in hedgehog-like fashion, emphasize it again. As AI evolves, it will continue to compel us to consider and redefine how we think about essentially human values like freedom, autonomy, and agency. Which trade-offs will we opt for? And how do we move forward productively in this environment to create the best possible world for us as individuals, yes, and also as members of a community, citizens of a nation state, part of humanity at large? This is the cue for me to return to the third observation I kicked off this speech with, the importance of designing and deploying AIs that prioritize individual agency. In part, I emphasize individual agency because it's obviously a value that has deep relevance for every human being on the planet. Most people recognize the virtue of having the capacity to take actions that transform their desires and plans into tangible realities. I also emphasize it because questions about individual agency lie at the heart of most of the major concerns about AI. For example, questions about job displacement are questions about individual human agency. Will I have the economic means to support myself and opportunities to engage in pursuits I find meaningful? Questions about disinformation and misinformation are questions about individual human agency. How do I know whom and what to trust as I make decisions that impact my life? Questions about privacy are questions about individual human agency. How do I maintain the integrity of my own identity and how I'm known in the world and preserve an authentic sense of self? But if AI threatens to undermine individual agency in various ways, its capacity to amplify, extend, and accelerate individual agency is unprecedented too. Here again is why I see such a parallel between AI and steam power. Working in tandem, intelligence and energy drive human agency and thus human progress. Intelligence gives us the capacity to weigh options and to envision and plan for different potential scenarios. Energy enables us to take action on whatever we aspire to achieve. The more intelligence and energy we can leverage on our behalf, the greater our capacity to make things happen individually and collectively. Because AI has the capacity to be agentic itself, setting goals and taking action on its own, under our direction, to achieve them. You can leverage AI in two distinct ways. In some ways, some instances, you might want to work closely with an AI, such as when you're learning a new language or practicing mindfulness skills. In others, such as optimizing your home's energy consumption based on real-time energy prices and weather forecast, you might prefer an AI to handle that by itself. Either way, the AI is increasing your agency because it's helping you take actions designed to lead to outcomes you desire. And either way, something new and transformative is happening. For the first time ever, synthetic intelligence, not just knowledge, is becoming as flexibly deployed as synthetic energy has been since the rise of steam power. Intelligence itself is now a tool, a scalable, highly configurable, self-compounding engine for progress. But who gets to use that tool? In what context? When OpenAI, the company that developed ChatGPT, launched in 2015, two of its co-founders posted an essay introducing their mission. We believe AI should be an extension of individual human wills and in the spirit of liberty as broadly and evenly distributed as possible, they wrote. In essence, they were first and foremost making the case for both negative liberty and positive liberty. AI tools, they suggested, should be extensions of individual human wills, not extensions of states or corporations. Individuals should be able to access and use these tools themselves without external actors prohibiting or mandating their use. Why was this specific framing so important? Once again, we can look to Sir Isaiah. While he made the case that both negative and positive liberty are necessary for a balanced and flourishing society, he also expressed some key reservations about positive liberty. Specifically, he worried that positive liberty and its emphasis on fulfilling one's potential could be co-opted in authoritarian ways. After all, if there's a better version of yourself that might be realized under certain optimal conditions, well then, why should society leave it to you to implement the policies and take actions that facilitate those conditions? Why should it trust you to make the right choices? We know you don't always stop at stop signs or obey speed limits. In other words, this is the road Sir Isaiah warned against because how it might lead to tyranny. It's also the road ChatGPT is designed to avoid as well. Now, to be clear, the existence of AI tools like ChatGPT won't stop governments, corporations, or other actors from using AIs in ways that attempt to automate decision-making and steer people towards specific choices and outcomes. I'd also note that such efforts potentially produce outcomes that benefit individuals and societies sometimes. They're part of the promise of AI too. But AI tools specifically designed to give individual users hands-on access to AI in ways that they can deploy in open-ended, self-determining ways to provide a powerful counterforce to that kind of authoritarian drift that concerns Sir Isaiah. In essence, this user-centric version of AI, one that privileges individual agency, offers a third way, one that blends the freedom from constraints that characterizes negative liberty with the freedom and agency to fulfill one's potential that characterizes positive liberty. In broad ways, I think tools like ChatGPT as a new form of informational GPS. In the 21st century, life as a human today means constantly upskilling. At work, yes, but everywhere else too. As we attempt to productively navigate a world that is increasingly constructed from information, tools like ChatGPT are infinitely applicable and extensible mapping systems that help you get from point A to point B with greater certainty and efficiency. For example, you can ask ChatGPT to translate a white paper on the central facet of machine learning, known as backprop, in a way that makes it understandable to a person with no computer science background. You can have ChatGPT evaluate terms and conditions for a proposed contract with a potential client in a country where you have no prior experience or knowledge of standard commercial practices. By providing accelerated fluency and navigational support on demand, tools like ChatGPT become keys to heightened participation and competence, but they never impose a single path to follow. Instead, they're like the navigational apps on your smartphone. A navigational app might be telling you to go left, but you can still choose to go straight if, for whatever reason, you think that's the best choice at the moment. When that happens, the app adjusts to your decision and recalibrates itself. It still tries to take you in the destination you've chosen, but you can always keep making choices of your own as well. And that's how ChatGPT works as well. It provides informational guidance. You can always reorient and redirect. It's simply by giving it new prompts, new instructions, new feedback on its outputs. In this incarnation of AI, users remain in the driver's seat. They choose when to use it and what to use it for. In doing so, tools like ChatGPT subvert the narrative of perfect control. In contrast, they offer what might be described as decentralized or distributed positive liberty, a form of liberty that explicitly empowers individual growth and self-actualization while also remaining free from unilateral top-down interventions. In addition to preserving autonomy, hands-on AI tools activate superagency, which, to revisit the definition I gave earlier, is what happens when millions of people start using powerful new tools in self-directed ways, and new competencies, innovation, and generativity start cascading throughout society. In this way, a doctor using AI to make better diagnoses isn't just fulfilling their own potential, they're creating better health outcomes for the entire patient population. A teacher leveraging AI to personalize learning isn't just becoming a better educator, they're elevating the educational experience for every student they encounter. Along with this rising tide of broadly distributed competence, there's another pro-social component to this approach as well. When millions or even billions of people have deep personal stake in something, it widens the aperture for consensus. This relates to the fourth observation I made at the start, namely that individual agency as a part of a larger framework, a pathway to collective action and broad prosperity. As crucial as it is to preserve space for individual agency in an AI works, it's equally crucial that we apply AI's power in more centralized ways. We can all benefit individually and collectively from AI's computational power to model climate change scenarios and optimize renewable energy grids that can support entire cities. We can all benefit individually and collectively from AI's pattern recognition capabilities to track emerging infectious diseases and coordinate rapid public health response across continents. We can all benefit individually and collectively from AI's analytic capabilities to help managing increasingly scarce resources like water, arable land in ways that serve entire populations equitably. But we also know this is an area of increasingly polarized politics where value pluralism can reign a little extreme. So how can nation states hope to achieve the social coherence that's needed to undertake big, ambitious, and possibly divisive projects using complex new technologies that many people have major concerns about? I believe that the best way to do this is to continue what we've been doing since ChatGPT's release 2 years ago. Give people opportunities to use AI directly in ways they find meaningful. Because in the end, what are you likely to trust more? Some abstract new technology government experts decide unilaterally to introduce without that much or even any input from you? Or a technology that you have growing personal connection to because you regularly use a form of it in trivial ways, sonnets, recipes, and life-changing ones, medical diagnoses, with increasing frequency as time goes on. When people use ChatGPT to automatically personalize their resume to dozens of different job postings, or to teach their child fractions, or understand their aging parents' medical diagnosis better, they develop both practical literacy and earn trust. And through hands-on engagement, we become more likely to appreciate the potential upsides of broader applications as well. We see it enhancing our own lives, so we can imagine it working in institutional and public sector scenarios too. What's in it for me leads naturally to what's in it for us. This doesn't magically eliminate value pluralism or reveal a perfect formula for reconciling incompatible or incommensurable values and intentions. Instead, it simply creates a context for potential consensus, a stronger shot at productive governance. In this way, we navigate to a world characterized by empowered individuals, shared purpose, high-functioning institutions, and thriving communities. As we break new ground on this journey, freedom and autonomy and other values will likely take on new contours, because this is inevitably what happens in moments of great technological change. Consider the early decades of the automobile and new seeming constraints in the form of speed limits, traffic lights, and designated roadways. Consider the internet and mobile phone era and new seeming infringements on our privacy that came with leading more legible lives. In both these instances, we were actually moving towards futures of greater mobility, more access to information and opportunities, more freedom to take actions and express our values, and realize our intentions in more ways. Once again, I believe we're on that journey with AI. By starting with individual agency and building towards shared purpose, we can avoid the false choice between unrestrained individual license and absolute centralized control. To truly flourish as individuals and as a society, we need both the freedom to chart our own course and the capacity to work together toward common aims, negative liberty and positive liberty. And that's what hands-on tools like ChatGPT enable. With this approach, there is no single route to follow or perfectly rationalized endpoint to pursue. Instead, it respects the pluralism of human values by allowing individuals to define and pursue their own goals while simultaneously creating pathways for collective action. So there will be competing interests and priorities, tensions between individual and collective needs, disagreements over implementation. In short, all the usual hallmarks of a dynamic, messy, and adaptive pluralist society, where progress is typically stochastic rather than linear. But while there is ample room for experiments in living, grassroots innovation, and multiple definitions of the good life, as many of history's most Fox-like commentators, everyone from John Stuart Mill to Sir Isaiah himself to ChatGPT, would no doubt assert that's a feature, not a bug. It's how we get to experiencing this to come to a consensus to make these difficult choices in balancing freedoms. Thank you.
Thank you. We're now able to take questions. Can I ask that you put your hands up for a question? There are people with mics. It's important that we hear your questions so that you wait for the mic to come to you. And if you could give your name and then keep your question short, please, to give other opportunities. So we'll take the gentleman here, Amanda.
Hi, Reid.
Hi, Saul.
Firstly, thank you so much for coming to London and the UK. It's a complete privilege to have you here. I know you don't come that often, so thank you. And thank you for the incredible talk. It was really inspiring. I think you've talked before about AI with, or sorry, rather AI for,
Yes.
and AI to. And there's sort of the dualism of AI being done to us, or AI working for us.
Yes.
And I think we talked maybe about a third way,
Yes.
which, maybe is a possibility. And I wondered if you could maybe talk a little bit about sort of AI with, because, I think it's quite scary to think of a world of AI for or AI to, which is sort of, it's kind of the dualism that we're talking about, especially when some of the people controlling the AI with or for are either state actors that we may not agree with, or private sector actors that we may not agree with and are opaque and lacking in governance.
Yeah, so this is one of these kind of the tensions that go in understanding the new technology is obviously, AI is being developed by a set of different corporations which have some shared interest with, some real shared interest with people, customers, enduring brand value, acceptance within a community, acceptance by the press. So they have a bunch of natural mechanisms to be responsive, but they also have their own interests as well. And one of the things that, I've had a number of conversations, including with Saul, about is to say that we want the technology companies to generally try to be much more transparent and in dialogue about where clearly the interests of both sorts lie, so that you can build trust that, okay, when you're telling me this AI tool is for me and is for use by me versus its use on me, that I understand what that is and how that operates. And the same kind of diversity of experience that I was advocating for super agency, that I am advocating for super agency, is also true of having a number of different corporations building the stuff, because if they are, for various reasons, they are compelled to be honest, because not only is the government compel them, but by the way, so do their employees, because their employees exist in these communities and everything else as well. So it's, what they're doing tends to be clear, and being clear and making a contractual commitment about what you're doing for individual agency helps us build trust. That doesn't mean, just as in the talk I just gave, that there won't be times where AI is doing something that says, hey, I really think you'd like this advertisement, or eat at Joe's, or something else. And those instances will happen. What we want to make sure is that they happen with your understanding and knowledge of how it's working. So it's both and this is what Saul was gesturing at, is that there's a collaboration between those two interests. And part of the multiple values, the pike and the minnow that I was talking about, is to have them designed in both. You'll need both to actually have the systems that will also enable the individual human agency. But I think part of the point of doing, like when I give talks like this, I generate an idea that I'm going to go and continue to develop and argue for. And part of it is that having an individual agency lens in the design and in how corporations design and think about their technology is one of the things I think will lead to both more productive individuals and this dance between organizations' interests, companies, governments, et cetera, and individuals, and to make that dance a good discussion that is much more productive for both. That's part of what I'm advocating for with super agency.
Right, another question, please. Yes, upstairs.
Wonderful lecture. I'm a professor in digital economy at the University of Surrey. You made a very compelling case that AI can demultiply individual agency, and that somehow, I didn't quite understand how, that would translate into a better collective agency. But to play devil's advocate, the AI that human individual access now doesn't come from the sky in a pure form. It is built by organizations who follow a logic of profit maximization. They design the interface in which we use AI. They designed this very AI based on certain objectives, which I think are, except some exceptions, and perhaps you're one of those, seem to be far removed from maximizing collective agency in a consensual way. So how do we go from tools that are being designed and sold to corporations who are going to buy them to reduce cost, automate work, from this business case within which AI is built and because of which AI is bought, to this dreamlike vision of a technologically enabled consensus and shared purpose? I would love to hear your view on that.
So for better or for worse, I have the book at the end of January is entirely answering this question at length. I will try a short answer. I will try a short answer here. So there's two parts to it, three parts. So one part that I talk more about in the book than in this talk is that one of the things that people misunderstand about corporations is that there are many networks of governance in the corporation. It's not just the legal system of the society they're in. They also have networks of governance that come from customers, networks of governance come from employees, networks of governance that come from press and engagement, networks of governance that come from shareholders. And when you look across all those networks of governance, they are not like, for example, screw over your customer for a penny is a very bad decision, right? So it's not like the pure profit maximization motive. They do have profit maximization there too, but they have a number of different other things that play into that. And all of those networks of governance also play into information that we get to see. It's part of the reason why there is journalism, why there is, whistleblowers, why there's a bunch of other things to show how that is. So that's kind of point one on companies. Point two is that when you have companies building this, there are blind spots. That is part of the reason why governance, regulation, inquiry is an important thing. But that the companies, and this is the reason why I was suggesting ChatGPT as a good example, like ChatGPT is not following today a profit maximization path, right? It might be in the future. I'm not making any future claims, but it is today following an engagement path. It is trying to provide a tool by which when anyone who is anywhere in the world who has access to it, it can provide them something of value. Part of that, and this is the magic that you were referring to, is like, well, what's the way you go from individual agency to collective agency? The basic arc of the argument is to say we don't have good intuitions until we actually engage with the technology as individuals. One of the mistakes that I think many thinkers make, including myself, I'm not exempting myself, is to overly imagine what the future work looks like today on the other side of a major technological change. And you're almost always wrong when you're doing that, either in positive or negative circumstances. You have to get into it and then be iterating, what is known as iterative deployment, which is what ChatGPT is doing, to get people to get a sense of an intuitive feel of where they like this the transformation of the landscape of agency and freedoms, and where they don't like it and how it needs to be modified. So the way that and it is a messy and inchoate and not an algorithmic process, by having iterative deployment by which a lot of individuals are empowered, then you begin to have a discourse that actually, in fact, really relates to what the future integration of this technology in our society should be. And that's what the arc is. Obviously, a book puts much more detail into the argument than I've just made, but that's the usual balance of these things.
We'll take a couple of questions at a time now. The gentleman over here and the gentleman on the aisle over here. So Amanda and Anthony.
I'm John Tsoulis. I'm the director of the Institute for Ethics and AI in Oxford. Great to see you,
yes.
Reid. I hope one of the positive outcomes of the US election is that we see you in the UK more often. So my question kind of follows on the previous questions. There's AI, but there's also who is developing AI. That is a handful of small, powerful corporations.
Yes.
Now, one point is that you described human nature as basically homo techne, that it's of our essential nature to make and to do things. And you've described AI as a tool enabling us to do that. But almost all of the AI corporations have the objective of creating artificial general intelligence, which doesn't sound like a tool. It sounds like a sort of entity that can replicate all human capabilities and perhaps to a higher level than any human. That sounds more like a replacement of a human than something that a human can use to assist them in making and doing. So it sounds like this is an anti-humanistic agenda. And the second point I'd make is, of course, Berlin is a pluralist, would talk about not just freedom, he'd also talk about equality, and he's aware of the tension between them. You've talked a lot about freedom as being something that will be widely distributed, the freedom generated by AI. Now, as you know, Acemoglu and Johnson, in their book Power and Progress, Acemoglu, recent Nobel Prize winner, said the historical track record is that technological advance does not conduce to general prosperity unless it is subject to genuine democratic control. And one of his worries in that book is that he thinks this isn't the case now, that it's actually a small set of interests that is driving the development of this technology. So there's no reason to think there will be an egalitarian outcome with respect to the generation of what you called super agency.
Is the other question at all related?
It is.
Could we have it, please?
So thanks so much for being here. I thought that was really, really fantastic.
And introduce yourself too.
My name's Ed Leon Klinger, and I'll start the conversation by saying I'm a big fan of AI, hugely optimistic about AI, and I run a technology business. So this question might sound slightly counterintuitive. It builds on this idea of AI being done for us, or to us, or with us. I'd propose maybe a more terrifying fourth option, which is without. AI being done without us, obviously being this idea that Nick Bostrom kind of talks quite eloquently about in Superintelligence, AI taking on a mind of its own and potentially becoming a very destructive force that has the ability to replace or indeed destroy humanity entirely. I wonder if you have any thoughts on this. If you think this is something we should be worried about, what should we as society, as businesses, as individuals, as governments be doing about it? And if you don't think this is something we should be worried about, help to put us all at ease and explain why we shouldn't be worried about this. Thanks.
All right, I'll start with that one and bridge to John's question. So we've all seen The Terminator. There's a lot of Hollywood films with the machines coming to get us. And two things. One, it isn't that I don't think that there shouldn't be any concerns, but I think that the concerns of what human beings do with AI trump what the machines will be doing, because among other things, we don't know where exactly path to superintelligence and self-awareness, and you know, there's a bid-ask spread of a lot of technologists debating speed and possibilities there. But here is a simple way of understanding what is frequently referred to as the existential risk discussion. So people will say, you know, does AI add an existential risk to humanity because you have killer robots, you know, either human-directed or robot-directed, equivalent, very simplistically. And the answer is there's above zero of an add there, but existential risk should be thought of as a portfolio. Robots are not nearly our biggest existential risk right now. Pandemics, nuclear war, asteroids, whole bunch of stuff. And a lot of them, like take, for example, pandemics, either man-made or natural, the only real defense I can see is AI. So I think its net contribution on the existential risk portfolio is to greatly reduce our existential risk. That doesn't mean if you kind of focus on the one case where someone's doing something really dumb with robots, that there isn't something you should watch to. But by the way, all of the companies, and this is part of what gives me a bridge to John's questions, are trying to do their best to, without any collusion on pricing or markets or other things, to share safety practices, to think about how to avoid these kinds of circumstances. Like, for example, if it starts to, like some of the scenarios that are talked about is, well, if it gets so intelligent and it develops a language that we don't understand and it's self-improving, try not to do that, right? You know, and it's very far away from doing any of that kind of stuff now. This is all in kind of more in science fiction land. So that's the broad existential risk. The reason why I am net positive, strongly positive on AI's contributing to lowering humanity's portfolio of existential risk. Then on corporations, and it is, a small number of companies that are building this, and we can get into a long debate about where I disagree with Darren's arguments and so forth, but it's always been the case in each new big technology of a small set of companies building it. And it's never been the case where governments are building it. Governments didn't build the first automobiles. They did create DARPANet, but they didn't create the institution of the internet. There's a set of different commercial practices. And yes, I think companies need to be beholden within democracies and have, kind of discussions about kind of like what are the ways that we shape this technology that influences kind of human society. But I think the thing that the dialogue so often misses is that all of these technologies that create these kind of general purpose technologies that create this society that we get comes from kind of commercial sectors growing them, right? Like they getting to scale. And in many cases, the commercial sector is even building, yes, based on university work and other things, but building new things. Like most, kind of current CS departments don't understand how scalable scalable compute works within the large companies unless they've gone to work there, because they don't have access to the resources, they don't understand what scale means and so forth. And so it's typical that companies do this building. And that sounds alarming when you're doing, and this is part of the reason I was advocating this thesis of super agency, to get people to get an individual experience. So I describe an iPhone to you as a GPS tracker that tracks you everywhere, that's listening to you whatever you're doing, and is looking through your camera. You go, holy shit, I don't want one of those, right? That's really terrible. And then I go, well, but actually, in fact, it helps you never be lost, helps you always be connected with your loved ones, and part of the governance of it is the governance that I was mentioning before, which is the governance we have now, which is not just governments doing stuff with companies, yes, but companies also living embedded within our social network of customers and employees and everyone else. And that actually interlocking networks of kind of consent to the governed is part of what actually, in fact, helps create that humanist future. And it isn't to say that companies don't sometimes go really wrong. Cigarette industry, as an example. But once you break particular, tightly held conspiracies, like one of the things that happens regularly with all the tech companies today is if one of the employees thinks that the tech company is doing something bad, they go talk about it, and we have this thing called the internet by which it can get very spread. And that also gets to the consent of the governed, and that's part of the reason why that kind of governance works. And so the usual slogan, rhetorical cry of companies being kind of sociopathic profit maximizers who are acting like Terminator robots is a mischaracterization. It's actually intellectually incorrect, right? So, but convenient for a headline slogan, right? So, it isn't that I'm saying that there isn't a very good thing for companies to be in dialogue, for regulation to exist. The patterns of regulation probably need to evolve. Like I think the industrial patterns of regulation don't work for the information age, don't work for the AI age. I think it's a different pattern. And part of it about regulation is that regulation enshrines the past, right? And for example, let's take a very concrete one from today. I know how to build, and I'm not alone, lots of people in the tech industry know how to build a medical assistant that's better than your average GP, that's available, could be available on a smartphone, that would cost no more than a couple dollars an hour to run, that could be available to everybody, 24/7, about your parents, your grandparents, your kids, your pets, the whole thing. Why doesn't it exist? It doesn't exist because of regulation, right? Liability says you can't build it. And so all of the builders of this stuff steer away from it as hard as they can. So you have to think about in regulation is how do we get to the future we want, not just how do we prevent the future we don't want. Because if we're only doing the prevention, we don't get there. And so, and I think that's part of the, like again, super agencies, the thesis of it is, as people begin to get actual experience versus, slogan headlines, they begin to realize they get their own intuitive feel about what they want and what they don't want. And that's the kind of paradox of what I think is no, we travel our way into the future, not we pre-plan the whole thing. And that's part of the argument.
We can take 3 more questions before the end. So, Amanda, the lady over here, a gentleman there, second row, sorry, behind you. And I'll wait till the mics have gone there. And one upstairs. Yes, the lady over there. Thank you. That's the 3 mics.
Great.
Is this up? Hi, thank you so much for talking to us. My name's Anushka, I'm a junior doctor. I'm just wondering, we talked a lot about freedom, but freedom is quite confusing because it's almost infinite. What would happen if we thought about it in terms of constraints? And then I guess we could have constraints that are freeing, like if you don't go through red lights, you'll be able to get to work and survive the next day. And constraints that are invisible, like you're prevented from having a certain political opinion because your phone only shows you certain things. And constraints that are visible, invisible, freeing, non-freeing. And I just wondered, what would you say are the most dangerous?
Oh, okay.
And how would you categorize them? And which ones can AI help us with versus non-help us with? And if an AI is constraining us, for example, you're not allowed to drink and drive, do we have an override button? Like, I want to get my child to hospital. I don't care if I've had a few.
I think yes, okay, I'll wait for the question. Yes.
My name is Robert Peston. I'm a journalist that you're counting on to keep companies honest.
Great, thank you.
First of all, I think, as passionate as probably anybody about the potential of artificial intelligence. I mean, I've been using it fairly obsessively for quite some time now. But I really want to go back to what John was talking about. When you talked about the original industrial revolution and the move to mass production, I'm sure you're aware that for all the long-term benefits in terms of wealth creation, freedom for individuals, that there was a period of decades that was subsequently caused Engels' pause, when the living standards of the majority of people fell and then stagnated, and it took an enormous amount of time for the productivity gains to feed through to people's living standards, people's welfare. And as somebody who's absolutely persuaded about the extraordinary productivity opportunities available from AI, I am anxious that there is no public debate about making sure that in a time through much of the West, where living standards have been stagnating for about 15 years, there is no public debate about how we ensure that these productivity gains get translated into better incomes, better lives for millions of people. And I really wanted to know there's no debate about, for example, among our leaders about the way the welfare system may have to change, the education system has to change. And I just really wondered what kind of leadership you want to see from politicians so that we don't go through another. Digital has been a winner-takes-all industrial revolution since the late 90s. It's one of the reasons inequality has increased so dramatically. How do we make sure that this latest and most dramatic phase of that industrial revolution doesn't see the gains accruing to too few inventors, backers, investors?
And one more, the lady up there.
Hi there, my name's Emily. I'm a researcher at the International Bateson Institute, and Gregory Bateson said that the problems of the world are to do with the difference between how people think and how nature works. And if we subscribe to that, I have some concerns. So you use the example of GPS and the ability to turn right, even if the GPS is saying turn left. Most of us might have the experience of perhaps getting a little bit too reliant on Google Maps to get wherever we are, even in the city. And I think generationally, we are losing the capacity to perhaps travel, looking up and asking questions, pausing, noticing, learning our way. So there are ways of knowing that are perhaps not prioritising efficiency and certainty. These stained glass windows, which arguably make this synagogue what it is, would not be created if those values were at the heart of our society. So my question to you is, how do we preserve some of the capacities, particularly the relational abilities, to care, to notice, to create, in a world where perhaps our perceptions are being limited by our reliance on technology, and in an infrastructure and an epistemology that is tending us generationally to notice less? Thank you.
So the arc of my three answers will be, part of the thesis in superagency is what's the lens and design principles that we should be advocating for the building of the next future AI. The future AI as they're going, and suggesting that some of the stuff that ChatGPT has been doing and others has been particularly important. So I'll take them in order. So one, on the questions of which constraints most concern me. Well, I guess I would, and this would play to the second question a little bit too. I want to make sure that, because some investment in AI will be job replacement. If you have jobs that are following a script that a robot can do better, then the robot should do the job, right? It just, like, it's the way it is. But that's not, I don't think, all jobs, even with the growing increase. For example, if you had a set of agents that made a salesperson more effective, no company that I know of would fire salespeople. They'd maybe hire more, right? Because they want to be much more effective in terms of what they're doing. So customer service, I think, a job that will see a lot of transformation. So in terms of constraint, it's not really as forms of constraint, but the thing that I'm trying to advocate for companies to do is to put as much energy into human amplification as the questions of, like going after the jobs that are essentially scripted already, as ways of doing it. And because I think that will be our more human future, and I think I think there's a lot of different opportunity there. Now, there's obviously a ton of things which can include, like, I think we have to be clear, it isn't just, AI makes this very apparent, but how information shapes our information space, where we have, a certain amount of kind of chaos that we haven't figured out how to manage, that goes from, the internet, some social networks, other things, and how to do that. But I'll start here as I get to the second question is, part of when you think technology is the problem, technology can also be the solution. So part of the answer is I'm worried about that the natural thing is to try to do job replacement as your primary function, and that's a good thing to do too, versus also job amplification. One of the benefits that AI has is that it can help you learn new jobs. Upskilling has been going, it's accelerating, but upgoing. It can help you find new jobs. It can help you chart paths and so forth. So the agents for you, amplifying you, I want companies building those alongside any times that they're also building kind of AIs that go, oh, I can answer the phone better than a human being can for customer service. So I want the human amplification, as I referred to impromptu, my last book, Amplification Intelligence. And I think if we're putting our finger on the scale anywhere, it should be demanding more of those, which then get to some of the question about how it gets distributed. I would like to see a medical assistant and a tutor on every smartphone as soon as we possibly can, right? Since it's very fashionable to, we've already had a couple questions about the profit maximizing giant corporations. At least some of these tech companies also do a lot on giving out digital goods. Like Google doesn't make any money from Google Translate, but it tries to make that available and so forth as part of it. It's just kind of instances. Now, of course, it's building brand impression and all the rest. So I think that's the part to the answer to the other question. And as part of the transition, yes, by the way, deep technological transformations human societies adopt very poorly to. So the Industrial Revolution is one, which you brought up. By the way, the printing press, decades of religious war as a function of that. So it's not only that one. Part of the reason to call attention to it is to say, well, let's try to do this one better, right? And part of, again, AI being potentially part of the solution is, what are the things that we need to help navigate this better? What are the things we should be asking from the corporations? What are the things we should be asking from our political leaders? Some good ones we have in the audience. and other things in order to get there. And what are the things that is part of having a dialogue? And part of the super agency thesis is saying that the best way to have that dialogue is actually having some direct exposure and involvement, because it forms your intuitions about what does the new landscape look like. And then that was the reason I also kept the questions in order. It is true that our human capabilities change. I mean, so before the printing press, memory was an extremely valued part of human cognition. And it has been on the decrease since then, right? Because it's not so much I have to remember what happened in chapter 2 of, like, if you ask me, recall unaided what chapter 4 of impromptu was, I don't remember I remember all of my arguments, but I don't remember which one's chapter 4, right? And so memory goes down. And there is some loss in these things, but I think the point about having an individual agency design aesthetic and a principle by which you're talking about freedom and ethics and a bunch of other things as a driving drumbeat then gives us the question of, part of it, some human beings want to be doing this kind of experience or creating these kinds of things, creating these amazing stained glass windows. And I think that at least we keep some of what that important thing is, even as other changes. But life's about change, and so I think it's an important point to raise, and it's an important point to keep in the dialogue, but I can't guarantee a similar experience as before. And so with that.
Thank you very much. My lords, ladies and gentlemen, I'm now going to hand over to Peter Halban, who's going to thank Reid Hoffman on behalf of Isaiah Berlin's family.
Thank you, Madeline. Rabbi Harris, thank you, Cooper, Madeline and Richard. You have once again brought us a speaker to address some of Isaiah's thoughts, some of their own thoughts. But tonight was truly extraordinary. Reid Hoffman, on this typically miserable afternoon, I prepared a few notes. As Isaiah so often said, throw them in the dustbin. So indeed, I have. You have covered everything that I could possibly think of, except for one or two that I will address in a moment. Democracy, humanities, humanism, morality, democracy, liberalism. By the way, I think you share something else with Isaiah. You are a combination of a hedgehog and a fox. Both of you are neither one nor the other. Then, I'm very pleased you told me that you did beat Isaiah. I did. What did you talk about? Not deep philosophy, not even Wittgenstein and yourselves. That he enjoyed, once again, seeing a bookshelf, like in Chekhov, filled with books. I will turn, on behalf of Isaiah and our mother, to more personal things. Isaiah had no idea how technology worked, but he was no Luddite. The moment the Walkman was invented, he bought many in each of his Harvard bags, together with his nuts and snacks, and would listen to his beloved operas and sonatas as he walked from Headington to Oxford, or in the hills of Italy, where we didn't find him for hours on end. He would have indeed applauded the developments in diagnostics and AI, as he indeed wrote many decades ago that there should be no borders between the humanities and science, upon which he founded Worcester College, and as you know only too well, remains so to this day. I must ask my wife to pass me what I was about to offer you. Isaiah once described himself equally as a Russian. Yes, we can still use that today. An Englishman. He said it takes 5 decades to become a British person. And a Jew, albeit under his own definitions. But one other preoccupation, which I think combines all his thoughts, was Israel. He used to be taken by his father every day by ship to mandatory Palestine, Israel, during the 30s. He was present at many discussions in America during the war. The last letter he wrote was to an ex-pupil of his from Israel, where they had discussed, this pupil begged him to write an article for an Israeli newspaper. He said, on no account. It's not for me. I'm not one of them. But a few days before he died, he sent, I think, a fax to that pupil saying, publish. His letter was published on the 5th of November, 1997, in Haaretz newspaper. Nearly 30 years later, Martin and I, as publishers, have published a very different approach to Israel. It's called Drawn to the Promised Land, a cartoon history of Britain, Palestine, and the Jews, 1917 to 1949. I would like to add this to thank you so much for your address.
I will add it to the library. Thank you.